Wyoming Territory, 1883. When a broken-down rancher sees a dying nurse abandoned at a frontier railway station, he makes a decision that changes everything. August Merritt hasn't spoken more than 10 words to another soul since prairie fire took his wife and half his cattle herd 6 months ago. His ranch is falling apart, creditors are circling, and he's barely hanging on. But when he sees Lenora Vale collapsed on that rain-soaked platform, barefoot, fevered, and discarded like unwanted cargo, something stirs in his chest. The conductor won't let her back on the train. The townspeople walk past. She's too weak to survive alone. So August does the unthinkable. He wraps his coat around her, lifts her into his wagon, and by sunset he's married her to keep her safe. But what happens when two broken souls try to heal each other in the unforgiving wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Wyoming Valley like a widow's veil, soft and grey and full of sorrow. August Merritt stood on the sagging porch of what had once been a proud ranch house, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The liquid sat bitter on his tongue, but he drank it anyway, habit being one of the few things that still anchored him to the living world. 6 months had passed since the fire. 6 months since the prairie wind had carried those orange demons across his land, devouring everything he'd built in 23 years of marriage. The house still stood, scorched but stubborn, like an old tree that refuses to fall even after lightning splits its heart. But the barn was gone. Half the pasture was gone. And Sarah, sweet Sarah with her gentle laugh and flour-dusted apron, she was gone too, buried beneath the cottonwood where they'd carved their initials as newlyweds. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. There was a time when this land hummed with life. Cattle lowing in the distance, Sarah singing while she tended her garden, the steady rhythm of honest work under an endless sky. Now the only sounds were the wind through the broken fence posts, and his own breathing, ragged and uncertain in the thin mountain air. August set down the cup and walked to the edge of the porch, his boots echoing hollow on the weathered planks. The remaining cattle, maybe 30 head out of what had been nearly 200, grazed in the far pasture, looking lost and small against the vastness. They'd need to be moved closer to the house before winter set in proper, but August couldn't seem to summon the will to ride out and gather them. Every task felt like moving through thick mud, each decision requiring more strength than he possessed. The letter from the bank sat folded in his shirt pocket, the paper worn soft from handling. He didn't need to read it again to know what it said. 3 months behind on the mortgage, foreclosure proceedings to begin if payment wasn't received by month's end. The words might as well have been written in a foreign tongue for all the meaning they carried. Numbers on paper couldn't capture the weight of a man's dreams, couldn't measure the value of ground soaked with sweat and tears and 23 years of shared hope. Sarah would have known what to do. She always did. While August tended the stock and mended fences, Sarah had managed the books, balanced the ledgers with the same gentle precision she brought to everything else. She could stretch $1 until it cried for mercy, make a feast from scraps, and somehow find money for seed when the winter had been too long and the spring too wet. But Sarah was 6 feet under, and August had learned that a man could be completely lost even on land he'd worked his entire adult life. He moved inside the house, where everything remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Her sewing basket sat beside. Her favorite chair, a half-finished quilt spread across the arm. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, though he hadn't seen her ghost hands at work there in weeks. He'd tried once to move her things, to pack them away, where they wouldn't mock him with their stillness. But his hands had trembled on her favorite teacup, and he'd left everything untouched, as if preserving the scene might somehow bring her back. The wedding ring, Sarah's wedding ring, sat in a small wooden box on the mantel. He'd removed it from her finger before the burial, unable to let that piece of her disappear into the earth. Sometimes, late at night, when the silence became unbearable, he'd take it out and turn it over in his palm, remembering the day he'd slipped it on her finger in the little church in town. She'd been 19, bright-eyed and fearless, ready to follow him to the edge of the world, if that's where his dreams led. And he'd led her here, to this valley, to this life, to this fire that had taken everything. The ring caught the morning, light filtering through the dusty windows, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall. Such a small thing to hold so much weight. Such a simple band of gold to represent a love that had shaped every decision, every hope, every dawn of the past 23 years. Now it sat silent and empty, just as he did. August poured himself fresh coffee from the pot on the stove, another habit that persisted even when appetite had long since fled. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, which struck him as grimly appropriate. He'd been moving through the world like a dead man himself, going through the motions of living without any of the substance, eating when hunger became pain, sleeping when exhaustion overtook grief, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and then only in grunts and single syllables. The few neighbors who still bothered to check on him had grown tired of his silence. Martha Henley from the next ranch over had stopped bringing casseroles when it became clear he wasn't eating them. Tom Brennan had offered to help with the cattle, but August had turned him away with a shake of his head and a closed door. Even Preacher Morrison had given up his weekly visits, defeated by August's stubborn refusal to engage with comfort or community. It wasn't that August didn't appreciate their efforts. In the rational part of his mind, the part that functioned despite the weight pressing down on his chest, he understood that people cared, that they wanted to help. But accepting help meant acknowledging that Sarah was really gone, that life was supposed to continue without her, and August wasn't ready for that acknowledgement. Might never be ready. He walked to the window that faced east, toward the road that led to town. It had been 2 weeks since he'd made the journey, 2 weeks since he'd spoken to another human being. The supplies were running low: coffee, flour, the basics that kept a man functional even when he'd lost all interest in living well. He'd have to go soon, whether he wanted to or not. The thought filled him with a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Town meant people. People meant questions, concerned looks, awkward silences where condolences used. To be, it meant seeing the way folks' eyes slid away from his, uncomfortable with the raw grief that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. It meant pretending to care about weather and crops and local gossip when the only thing that mattered to him lay buried under 6 feet of Wyoming soil. But a man had to eat, even a man who'd forgotten why eating mattered. And there were always supplies needed: lamp oil, salt, the necessities that marked the difference between surviving and simply dying slowly. So he'd go. He'd hitch up the wagon, make the ride into town, conduct his business with as few words as possible, and return to his self-imposed exile. The decision made, August felt no relief, only resignation. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the dry sink, and pulled on his coat. The same coat he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, the same coat he wore everywhere now because choosing different clothes required more energy than he possessed. Outside, his horse Buck waited in the small paddock near the house, the only animal August still bothered to keep close. Buck had been Sarah's choice, a gentle bay gelding with patient eyes and steady temperament. Now the horse seemed to understand August's moods, standing quietly while August fumbled with tack and harness, never shying from the tremor in his hands or the occasional curse when grief made him clumsy. The wagon ride to town would take the better part of 2 hours, time enough for August to steel himself against the inevitable encounters with well-meaning neighbors. Time enough to practice the minimal responses that would get him through the necessary transactions and back to the blessed isolation of his ranch. Time enough to remember why he'd chosen this particular morning to venture back into the world of the living. He didn't know, as he guided Buck down the rutted road toward town, that this day would be different from all the others. Didn't know that the railway station would hold something that would crack open the careful shell he'd built around his heart. Didn't know that by sunset, his life would be forever changed by a simple act of unexpected kindness. All he knew was the rhythm of Buck's hooves on hard-packed earth, the familiar weight of solitude, and the persistent ache that had become his constant companion. The morning mist was burning off now, revealing the stark beauty of the Wyoming landscape. Endless sky, rolling hills, the kind of vista that had once filled him with pride and possibility. Now, it only reminded him of how small one man's grief could feel under such vastness, and how utterly alone a person could be, even in the place they'd called home for more than half their life. The town of Cedar Falls had grown around the railway station like a flower around a stone, dependent on the iron lifeline that connected their isolated corner of Wyoming to the wider world. August guided Buck through the familiar streets, noting the changes that had accumulated during his weeks of absence: new paint on the mercantile, a fresh grave in the cemetery, children who seemed to have grown taller in the space between one sorrow and the next. He conducted his business with mechanical efficiency. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, salt, the basics that kept a man alive when living had become merely a matter of biological necessity. The storekeeper, old Henrik Larsen, tried twice to engage him in conversation about the weather, the cattle market, anything that might pierce the wall of silence August carried like armor. Both attempts met with polite nods and exact change, counted out in careful quiet. The rain began as August loaded his supplies into the wagon, a cold, persistent drizzle that seemed to seep through cloth and skin straight to the bone. He'd planned to head straight home, to return to the familiar solitude of his ranch, where grief could expand to fill all available space without bumping against the discomfort of others. But Buck chose that moment to favor his left front hoof, a slight hesitation in his gait that August's experienced eye caught immediately. "Easy, boy," August murmured, running his hands down the horse's leg. A stone lodged between shoe and hoof. Nothing serious, but it would need attention before. The long ride home. The railway station had a covered platform where he could work dry, and August led Buck across the muddy street with the patience of a man who understood that some problems couldn't be rushed. The station platform buzzed with the controlled chaos of departure. The afternoon eastbound train hissed and grumbled like a metal dragon, passengers hurrying through the rain with carpetbags and urgent purposes. August found a quiet corner where he could tend Buck's hoof without interfering with the human traffic, pulling his knife from his belt to worry the stubborn stone free. That's when he heard the conductor's voice, cutting through the rain and steam with bureaucratic finality. "Can't have her on my train, gentlemen. Regulations are clear. No passengers too sick to travel. She could die before we reach Cheyenne, and that's liability the railroad won't accept." August glanced up from Buck's hoof to see a small crowd gathered near the passenger car. Two men in city clothes flanked a figure slumped on a wooden bench. As a woman, he realized, though she was so still and pale, she might have been carved from wax. Her hair hung lank and dark around a face that seemed all angles and shadows, and her dress, once probably respectable, now hung on her frame like cloth, draped over kindling. "She paid her fare same as anyone," one of the men protested, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone going through motions rather than fighting for principle. "Got her ticket right here. Fare or no fare. She's not boarding." The conductor, a thick-set man with the officious bearing of petty authority, stood with arms crossed and jaw set. "Look at her. Barely breathing, running fever, weak as a newborn calf. She belongs in a hospital, not on my train." August freed the stone from Buck's hoof with a sharp twist of his knife, but found himself listening rather than preparing to leave. There was something about the tableau that held his attention, not the argument itself, which was clearly a lost cause, but the absolute stillness of the woman at its center. She sat with the resignation of someone who had expected nothing. Better, who had perhaps grown accustomed to being discussed rather than included, discarded rather than claimed. "What's wrong with her?" asked a woman in an elaborate traveling dress, clutching her reticule as if poverty might be contagious. Consumption, maybe, or just plain worn out. The conductor shrugged with the callousness of a man who'd seen too much human misery to let it touch him. "Found her like this in the depot at Fort Russell. Soldiers said she used to work there, some kind of nurse or such, but took sick and couldn't do the job anymore. They put her on the train west, figured she could find work in California or Oregon. And if she can't travel?" The woman's voice carried more curiosity than compassion. "Not my problem." The conductor pulled his watch from his vest pocket with theatrical precision. "Train leaves in 5 minutes, with or without passengers who can't sit upright long enough to reach the next station." The two men exchanged glances that spoke of calculations made and decisions reached. August watched them step back from the bench, distancing themselves from a problem they'd apparently concluded wasn't worth solving. Other passengers began to board, flowing around the abandoned woman like water around a stone, eager to get out of the rain and onto their dry seats. "Come on then, miss." One of the men made a half-hearted attempt at assistance. "Train's not going to wait, and if you can't travel—" The woman, girl really, for August could see now that she was younger than he'd first thought, lifted her, head with visible effort. Her eyes, when they opened, were startlingly blue against the pallor of her face, and for a moment they held an alertness that seemed at odds with her physical condition. "I understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "Above the rain and steam. Thank you for trying." The dismissal was so quietly dignified, so utterly without self-pity, that August felt something stir in his chest. A recognition, perhaps, of a particular kind of courage that showed itself not in grand gestures, but in small graces under impossible circumstances. The men tipped their hats and hurried toward the train, leaving her alone on the bench as the platform emptied around her. August watched the train pull away in a cloud of smoke and cinders, taking with it the last easy solution to the problem of one discarded young woman. The platform fell quiet except for the sound of rain on the wooden roof and the distant conversation of townspeople who had witnessed the scene but chosen not to intervene. "Too weak to travel," muttered someone behind August. "Probably die before." "Morning anyway." "Not our responsibility," came the reply. "Plenty of folks got troubles without taking on someone else's." The voices faded as their owners hurried away, leaving the platform to August, his horse, and the woman who sat so still she might have been part of the furniture. She'd pulled a thin shawl around her shoulders, inadequate protection against the October chill, and seemed to be gathering herself for some effort August couldn't imagine. Perhaps she planned to walk somewhere, though he couldn't see how she'd manage more than a few steps in her condition. Buck nudged August's shoulder, patient but clearly ready to head home. August patted the horse's neck absently, his attention still fixed on the solitary figure 20 feet away. He told himself it wasn't his concern, that he had problems enough without adding someone else's troubles to his load. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons to mind his own business. He barely had resources to keep himself fed. He knew nothing about caring for sick people. He'd withdrawn from human contact for good reason. But something about her stillness reminded him of his own, the way a person sat when they'd accepted that the world had finished with them, when fighting had given way to a kind of hollow endurance. And something about her dignity and abandonment struck a chord. He'd thought grief had silenced permanently. Before he fully realized what he was doing, August found himself walking across the platform. His boots echoed on the wet wood, and the woman's head turned toward the sound with the careful movement of someone who'd learned to conserve every bit of strength. "Miss," August's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from disuse. "You got somewhere to go?" She studied his face for a long moment. those startling blue eyes taking in details with the precision of someone trained to make quick assessments. When she spoke, her voice carried the faint accent of education, of someone who'd learned to speak properly, despite whatever circumstances had brought her to this rain-soaked platform. "I'm afraid not," she said simply, "but thank you for asking." The honesty of it, no false bravado, no attempts to minimize her situation, hit August somewhere deep in his chest. Here was someone who understood that sometimes life stripped away everything except the choice of how to face the stripping. "Got a name?" "Lenora Vale." A pause, then, "And you?" "August Merritt." He found himself removing his hat, a gesture of respect his mother had drilled into him decades ago. "I've got a wagon and a ranch about 2 hours' ride. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that seemed incongruous with her physical frailty. Why? It was a fair question, and August found he didn't have a good answer. Why indeed? Why risk the complications that came with helping a stranger? Why invite another person's problems into his carefully maintained isolation? "Don't rightly—" "No," he admitted. "Just seems like the thing to do." Lenora was quiet for so long that August began to think she'd refuse his offer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be a burden. We're all burdens." "To somebody," August replied, surprising himself with the words. "Question is whether we're burdens worth carrying." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or hope trying to kindle, despite better judgment. She attempted to stand, wavered, and would have fallen if August hadn't stepped forward to steady her. Up close, he could feel the fever radiating from her skin, could see the fine tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion beyond mere tiredness. "Let me help," he said, and meant it in ways that surprised him. Together they made their slow way to his wagon, August bearing most of her weight while she struggled to contribute what little strength she possessed. The townsfolk who witnessed their progress offered no assistance, but August found he didn't care. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to move forward that had nothing to do with his own grief. As he helped Lenora into the wagon and tucked his coat around her shivering form, August caught sight of something that would prove significant in ways he couldn't yet imagine. A small leather medical bag clutched in her free hand, battered but well-maintained, the kind of tool that spoke of serious training and hard-won experience. "We'll get you somewhere warm," he promised, taking up the reins as Buck began the familiar journey home. "Rest now." Lenora nodded, already fading into the exhausted sleep of the truly ill, trusting this stranger with her life because she had no other choice. August guided the wagon through the muddy streets of Cedar Falls, not knowing that by sunset he would be married to the woman sleeping fitfully beside him, not knowing that this single act of unexpected kindness would reshape both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the world and preparing the ground for whatever strange seeds this day had planted. The ride back to the ranch passed in a haze of practical concerns and growing uncertainty. August found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him, noting the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat, the way her breathing seemed to require conscious effort. By the time they reached his property, Lenora had slipped into the kind of deep, fever-driven sleep that looked uncomfortably close to unconsciousness. August carried her into the house with the careful attention he'd once reserved for newborn calves, supporting her head, mindful of every jostle and bump. She weighed almost nothing, all sharp angles and prominent bones beneath her worn dress. In the afternoon light filtering through his kitchen window, her pallor was even more pronounced, her lips tinged with the grayish blue that spoke of a body struggling to maintain its most basic functions. He settled her on the old horsehair sofa in the front room, the same piece of furniture where Sarah used to sit with her mending in the evenings. The comparison struck him like a physical blow. Sarah, warm and vital and filled with purpose, versus this stranger who seemed to be holding on to life by the thinnest of threads. For a moment, The weight of what he'd done crashed down on him. What did he know about nursing? What business did he have bringing home a sick woman when he could barely manage to keep himself fed and functional? But Lenora stirred slightly at his touch, and her eyes opened with that same startling alertness he'd noticed at the station. Even in her weakened state, there was something in her gaze that spoke of intelligence, of a mind that remained sharp despite her body's rebellion. "Where?" she began, then seemed to remember. "Your ranch. I'm sorry, I must have—" "No apology needed," August said gruffly. "You're sick. Rest is what you need." He busied himself building up the fire, grateful for a task that didn't require no conversation. The flames caught and spread, throwing warm light across the room and chasing away some of the afternoon's chill. From his mother's old cedar chest, he retrieved a quilt, handmade and heavy, stitched with the patient love that characterized everything his mother had touched. The quilt had been Sarah's favorite, and August's hands hesitated on the familiar fabric before spreading it carefully over Lenora's trembling form. "This is very kind," Lenora said, her voice stronger now that she was warm and horizontal. "I don't even know you, and you've—" "Don't know you either," August interrupted, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Sometimes that makes things simpler." She studied his face with that peculiar intensity of hers, as if she were cataloguing details for some future reference. "You've lost someone recently." It wasn't a question, and August felt his defenses rise. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move through your own house," she said simply, "like you're trying not to disturb something that's no longer there. And this quilt, it smells like lavender and careful keeping, a woman's touch." August turned back to the fire, unwilling to meet her perceptive gaze. "My wife. 6 months ago. I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of genuine. Understanding that surprised him. "Was she ill?" "Fire," August said curtly. "Prairie fire took the barn, half the stock, and—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud the way Sarah had died, trying to save the horses she'd loved. Lenora was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I've seen fire," she said. "Different kind, but fire all the same. It changes everything it touches, doesn't it? Even the things it doesn't burn." Something in her tone made August look at her more closely. There was knowledge in her words, the kind that came from personal experience rather than mere sympathy. But before he could ask what she meant, Lenora's eyes had drifted closed again, and her breathing settled into the rhythm of genuine rest. August found himself with an unexpected problem. He had no idea how to care for a sick person. Sarah had always handled such things with the natural competence she brought to everything domestic. When neighbors took ill, she'd appear with soup and practical advice, returning daily until the crisis passed. August's medical knowledge extended to treating injured livestock and setting his own broken bones, skills that seemed inadequate for someone in Lenora's condition. He made coffee by habit, then realized she probably couldn't keep it down. Soup would be better, but his cupboards held only the basics: beans, salt pork, flour. Nothing suitable for an invalid. The thought of riding back to town for proper supplies filled him with weariness, but Lenora would need more than what he had to offer if she was going to recover. As if sensing his dilemma, Lenora opened her eyes again. "Mr. Merritt, August?" "Present," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "What do you need?" "If you have any willow bark, I could make tea. It would help with the fever." Her voice was gaining strength, though she still spoke carefully, as if words required rationing. "Or elderflower, if you have it. Your wife, did she keep medicinal herbs?" August nodded toward the kitchen. "Sarah always kept things growing. Haven't paid much attention to what's still there." "Would you mind if I looked? When I'm feeling steadier, I mean. I have some knowledge of healing plants." "You're a nurse," August said, remembering the conductor's words. "Was," Lenora corrected. "Trained at the military hospital in St. Louis, then served at frontier posts for several years. Before—" she gestured vaguely at her current condition. "Before this, what happened?" Lenora's expression grew guarded. "I took ill. Consumption. They thought, though I suspect it was simply exhaustion and poor nutrition. Military medicine isn't always kind to those who practice it. She pulled the quilt more tightly around herself. When I couldn't perform my duties, they discharged me. Medical unfitness, they called it. The bitterness in her voice was carefully controlled, but August heard it anyway. He'd known soldiers in his time, had served briefly during the war, and he understood the casual cruelty of institutions that used people up and discarded them when they were no longer useful. Their loss, he said simply. Lenora looked surprised, as if she'd expected skepticism or pity rather than matter-of-fact acceptance. You don't know what kind of nurse I was. I might have been terrible at it. Doubt that, August replied. Woman who knows about willow bark and pays attention to how a man moves through his own grief. That's someone who notices things. Noticing is most of what doctoring is, seems to me. A ghost of a smile touched Lenora's lips. You might be right. About that, they fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that sometimes developed between strangers who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. August tended the fire while Lenora dozed fitfully, and slowly the afternoon gave way to evening. The simple routine of checking the flames, adjusting the quilt, listening for changes in her breathing. These small acts of care awakened something in August that he'd thought died with Sarah. Not love, exactly, but purpose, the sense that his actions mattered to someone other than himself. As darkness settled over the ranch, August lit the oil lamps and considered the practicalities of the situation. Lenora would need proper food, medicine, time to recover her strength. He'd need to ride to town again, face the questions that would inevitably come. Mrs. Henley would want to know who the strange woman was, and Preacher Morrison would feel obligated to inquire about the propriety of the arrangements. The whole thing was complicated in ways August hadn't considered when he'd acted on impulse at the railway station. But looking at Lenora now, still pale but breathing easier, her sleep more natural than the fever-driven unconsciousness of earlier, August found he didn't regret his decision. There was something right about having another person in the house, even a stranger. The silence that had been his constant companion for months felt less oppressive with someone else to share it. August? Lenora's voice was barely a whisper. Here, thank you. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of meaning that went beyond mere gratitude for taking a chance on someone you don't know. Everyone deserves a chance, August replied, then realized he was speaking as much to himself as to her. Get some rest now. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you properly fed and doctored. Lenora nodded and settled deeper into the quilt, trusting him with her vulnerability in a way that humbled him. August banked the fire for the night and made his way to his own room, leaving the door open so he could hear if she needed anything. For the first time in months, he wasn't dreading the sunrise. The morning brought unexpected complications. August woke to the sound of Lenora moving about the kitchen, and he found her attempting to prepare coffee, despite the obvious effort it cost her. She'd somehow managed to wash and rebraid her hair, and though she still looked fragile as spun. Glass! There was a determined set to her shoulders that spoke of someone unaccustomed to being helpless. You should be resting, August said, taking the coffee pot from her unsteady hands. I should be useful, Lenora replied firmly. You've taken me in, given me shelter, and I won't repay that kindness by lying about like an invalid. You are an invalid, August pointed out with characteristic bluntness. Least for now. Lenora's smile was rueful but genuine. Perhaps. But I'm a restless invalid, and I heal better when I'm moving. She gestured toward the window that faced the side yard. I noticed you have some cattle that look poorly. The spotted one especially. She's favoring her left side in a way that suggests internal pain. August followed her gaze, surprised that she'd been observant enough to notice the animals from the house. Bessie, his best milk cow, had indeed been acting strangely for the past few days, though August had attributed it to the general decline that seemed to affect everything on his ranch lately. You know about cattle medicine? He asked. I know about bodies, Lenora said simply. Human, bovine, the principles are often similar. May I take a look at her? Against his better judgment, August found himself helping Lenora into her coat and supporting her careful walk to the small paddock where he kept the dairy stock. Bessie stood apart from the other animals, her breathing labored and her usually bright eyes dull with pain. Lenora approached the cow with the patience of someone trained to work with frightened creatures, speaking in low, soothing tones as she ran experienced hands along Bessie's flanks. "Here," she said after a moment, pressing gently just behind the cow's ribs. "Feel this." August placed his hand where she indicated and immediately felt the hard, swollen mass that he'd somehow missed in his own examinations. "What is it?" "Likely a blockage in her digestive tract, common enough in cattle that don't get enough roughage." Lenora continued her examination, her movements confident despite her obvious weakness. "She needs mineral oil to help move things, a long and a mash of bran and molasses to encourage eating. Do you have those supplies?" August nodded, impressed despite himself. In 10 minutes this slip of a woman had diagnosed a problem that had been troubling him for days. Under her direction, he prepared the treatment, watching as Lenora coaxed the reluctant cow to accept the medicine with a gentleness that reminded him of Sarah's way with animals. "There," Lenora said, stepping back with satisfaction. "She should improve within a day or two. Keep her on soft feed and watch for signs of renewed appetite." "Where'd you learn to doctor cattle?" August asked, as they walked slowly back to the house. "Frontier posts don't always have veterinarians," Lenora explained. "When the cavalry horses took sick or the officers' livestock needed attention, they turned to whoever had medical training. I learned to adapt human treatments to animal needs." She paused, one hand against the porch rail for support. "It was often more rewarding than treating the soldiers, if I'm being honest. Animals don't argue with your diagnosis or refuse treatment out of pride." Back inside, August made them both breakfast, simple fare of eggs and bacon, but Lenora ate with the appreciation of someone who'd grown accustomed to irregular meals. As her strength returned over the following days, she began to make small improvements around the ranch that August hadn't even realized he needed. She reorganized his medical supplies with military efficiency, identified and harvested the medicinal plants still growing in Sarah's abandoned garden, and somehow managed to coax his temperamental chickens into laying more consistently than they had in months. "You don't have to do all this," August told her one afternoon, finding her hanging washing on the line despite his protests. "Yes, I do," Lenora replied, pinning one of his shirts with careful precision. "You saved my life. August, the least I can do is try to improve yours." It was during these days of recovery that August began to see glimpses of who Lenora had been before illness and military bureaucracy had worn her down. She had a quick mind and quicker hands, the kind of practical intelligence that could adapt to any situation. When she discovered Sarah's garden tools in the shed, her eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. "May I?" she asked, hefting Sarah's favorite spade, a small, well-balanced tool that had shaped countless rows of vegetables and flowers. August felt the familiar tightness in his chest at seeing someone else handle Sarah's things, but Lenora's. Reverence for the tool, the way she tested its weight and examined its edge with professional interest, somehow made the moment bearable. "Sarah always said good tools were like good friends," August found himself saying, "worth taking care of." She was right. Lenora ran her thumb along the spade's worn handle, feeling the smooth spots where Sarah's hands had gripped it through years of use. "This has been well loved. I can tell by the way it sits in the hand." She began work on the garden that very afternoon, despite August's protests about her health. But there was something almost miraculous about watching her move through the overgrown beds, identifying useful plants among the weeds, salvaging what could be saved, and planning what could be replanted. Her movements were economical but graceful, and August found himself remembering why Sarah had loved this patch of ground so much. "The soil is good," Lenora said, straightening to ease a cramp in her back. "Rich and well composted. Whoever tended this garden knew what they were doing. Sarah did, August said simply. Everything she touched seemed to grow. Lenora nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. Would it trouble you if I tried to restore it? I won't change anything fundamental, just tend what's here. The question caught August off guard. He'd assumed the garden would remain a monument to Sarah's absence, another piece of his life frozen in the moment of loss. But watching Lenora work among the plants, seeing the careful attention she paid to each struggling survivor, he realized that Sarah would have wanted the garden to live, to continue providing sustenance and beauty even without her hands to guide. She'd like that, he said finally. Sarah always said gardens were meant for the living. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. For the first time since the fire, August was contemplating a future that extended beyond mere survival, considering the possibility that life might continue to offer moments of grace and purpose even after devastating loss. That evening, as they sat by the fire after a simple supper, Lenora voiced the question that had been hanging between them for days. "What happens when I'm well?" she asked quietly. "When I'm strong enough to travel again?" August poked at the fire with unnecessary vigor, buying time to frame his answer. The truth was that he'd grown accustomed to having her there, to the sound of another person moving through his house, to conversations that ranged beyond weather and cattle prices. But he also understood that her presence was temporary, that she had her own life to rebuild once her health returned. "Don't know," he admitted. "Suppose that's up to you." Lenora was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I have nowhere to go," she said finally. "No family, no prospects. The military pension barely covers basic expenses, assuming they continue to pay it." She looked at him with those startling blue eyes. "I could stay, if you'd have me, earn my keep helping. With the ranch, maybe start a small medical practice for the local folks. But I won't impose where I'm not wanted." The offer hung in the air like smoke, sweet and insubstantial, and somehow essential. August considered the practical aspects, the gossip it would generate, the questions about propriety, the complications of having an unmarried woman living on his ranch. But he also thought about Bessie, now fully recovered thanks to Lenora's intervention, about the garden beginning to show signs of renewed life, about the way silence felt less oppressive when shared with someone who understood its weight. "Might work," he said carefully, "if you're sure it's what you want." Lenora's smile was the first truly radiant expression he'd seen from her, transforming her pale features and revealing a glimpse of the woman she'd been before circumstances had worn her down. "I'm sure," she said, "more sure than I've been about anything in a very long time." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the barn walls and reminding them both that winter was coming. But inside the house, with the fire crackling and two people who'd found unexpected companionship in shared solitude, the future seemed less daunting than it had in months. Neither of them spoke of love. That word still belonged to the past, to memories too precious to disturb. But something was growing between them, something built on mutual respect and practical partnership, and the simple recognition that some burdens were easier to carry when shared. As August banked the fire for the night and Lenora settled onto the sofa that had become her temporary bed, both felt the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent, and the tentative hope that tomorrow might offer even better possibilities. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass and reminding both August and Lenora that their tentative arrangement would soon face the test of a Wyoming winter. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past weeks, August handling the heavy ranch work, while Lenora managed the household and tended to smaller tasks that required a gentler touch. It was a partnership born of necessity, but August found himself genuinely appreciating her contributions in ways that went beyond mere practicality. It was while organizing the papers in Sarah's old writing desk that Lenora made a discovery that would change everything between them. She'd been looking for seed catalogues, planning the garden's spring expansion, when her fingers found a small bundle of documents tucked behind a hidden drawer panel. Military discharge papers, creased and yellowed with age, but bearing official. Seals and signatures that spoke of legitimate service. "August," she called, her voice carrying an odd tension. "Could you come here, please?" He found her sitting at the desk, the papers spread before her with the careful precision of someone trained to handle important documents. Her face was pale, but not with illness this time, with something that looked almost like fear. "What is it?" August asked, settling into the chair across from her. Lenora's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the papers. "These are my official discharge documents, the ones the army said were lost when I left Fort Russell." She looked up at him with eyes that held both relief and apprehension. "Do you understand what this means?" August studied the documents, noting the official seals and formal language, but the significance escaped him. "Help me understand. When they discharged me, they claimed my paperwork had been misfiled. Without proper documentation, I couldn't prove my service record, couldn't access my pension, couldn't even get a reference for civilian employment." Lenora's voice grew stronger as she explained. "These papers, they prove I served with distinction for 7 years. More than that, they show I was promoted twice for exceptional service under combat conditions." She pulled out a particular document, a commendation signed by a Colonel Marcus Webb. "This is from the Battle of Little Wind River. I performed field surgery under fire for 18 straight hours, saved 37 men who would have died without immediate intervention." Her voice carried a quiet pride that August had never heard before. "They called me indispensable, said I was the finest combat medic they'd ever seen." August read the commendation carefully, noting the specific language that praised not just Lenora's medical skills, but her courage and leadership under extreme pressure. This wasn't the record of someone discharged for medical unfitness. This was the record of a decorated veteran. "If you had all this recognition, why did they let you go?" August asked. Lenora's expression darkened. "Because I treated Confederate prisoners with the same care I gave Union soldiers, because I refused to let wounded men die based on the color of their uniform." She stood and walked to the window, her shoulders rigid with remembered anger. "Colonel Webb tried to protect me, but there were complaints from certain officers who felt I was inappropriately humanitarian." August felt a cold anger building in his chest. He'd seen enough of war to know that the men who complained loudest about humanitarian treatment were usually those who'd seen the least actual combat. "So they drummed you out on false medical grounds. They said I was suffering from nervous exhaustion, that prolonged exposure to battlefield conditions had made me unfit for service." Lenora's voice was bitter. "They couldn't court-martial me for treating wounded enemies. That would have looked bad in the official records. But they could claim I was mentally unstable and quietly remove me from service. And now," Lenora turned from the window, her expression thoughtful, "now I have proof of what really happened. With these documents, I could appeal my discharge, demand reinstatement or proper compensation. I could clear my name." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. August understood that the woman he'd rescued from a railway platform was not the broken-down invalid he'd initially believed her to be. Lenora Vale was a decorated veteran, a skilled surgeon, someone whose talents extended far beyond what he'd imagined. She had options now, possibilities that went beyond staying on a failing ranch with a grieving widower. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. Lenora was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the commendation. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to fight, to demand justice for what they did. But another part of me—" She looked around the room, taking in the simple furnishings and the view of the recovering garden beyond the window. A part of me wonders if I've already found something better than vindication." August felt his heart clench with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You could go back to military medicine. With your record, they'd probably give you a choice of assignments." "I could," Lenora agreed. But do I want to? I've spent 7 years following orders, moving from post to post, never having anything that belonged to me except what fit in a medical bag. She moved to the chair across from him, settling with the careful grace he'd come to recognize. Here, I have a garden. I have work that matters. I have... She paused, searching for words. I have the first real home I've known since I was a child. August felt something tight and anxious in his chest begin to loosen. The ranch isn't much to look at these days. It's not about what it looks like, Lenora said firmly. It's about what it could become, what we could build here if we both stayed. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. I could establish a proper medical practice. The nearest doctor is 30 miles away, and there are plenty of folks in these parts who need regular care. You could expand the cattle operation, maybe add sheep or horses. With 2 incomes, we could make this place profitable again. The vision she painted was seductive, a future where the ranch thrived, where both of them had purpose and security. But August knew there were complications that went beyond simple economics. People will talk, he said. Unmarried woman living on a bachelor's ranch. Some folks won't like it, no matter how practical the arrangement. Lenora's expression grew thoughtful. There are ways to address that concern, if it becomes a problem. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. August found himself studying her face, noting the determined set of her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes. This was not the grateful invalid he'd rescued, but a competent adult proposing a partnership based on mutual benefit and shared goals. You'd be willing to make it legal? He asked carefully. A marriage of convenience to protect both our reputations. I'd be willing to make it real, Lenora said quietly. If you were. The words hit August like a physical blow. He'd grown comfortable with the idea of partnership, of shared labor and companionship. But the suggestion of genuine marriage, of opening his heart to someone new, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd shared with Sarah. I loved my wife, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. I know, Lenora replied, her voice gentle but firm. And I'm not asking you to stop loving her. I'm asking if you think you could learn to love me too, given time and patience and the chance to build something together. August stood and walked to the mantel, where Sarah's wedding ring still sat in its small wooden box. He picked up the box, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the promises it represented. I don't know if I can, he admitted. Don't know if it's fair to you or honest to her memory. Lenora rose and joined him at the mantel, her presence warm and solid beside him. Maybe fairness isn't the right question, she said softly. Maybe the question is whether Sarah would want you to spend the rest of your life alone, whether she'd approve of you helping someone who needed help. August thought about Sarah's generous heart, her instinct to nurture and protect anyone who crossed her path. She'd have liked Lenora, he realized, would have appreciated her competence and her kindness, her willingness to work hard and contribute to something larger than herself. She'd want me to be happy, he said finally. Then maybe. That's where we start, Lenora suggested. Not with grand declarations or passionate promises, but with the simple goal of making each other happy, building something good together. August looked at the woman beside him. Strong despite her recent illness, intelligent despite the circumstances. That had brought her low, kind despite the injustices she'd suffered. He thought about the weeks they'd shared, the easy partnership that had developed between them, the way his house felt like a home again when she moved through it. It wouldn't be like it was with Sarah, he said. No, Lenora agreed. It would be something entirely different, but different doesn't necessarily mean lesser. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Inside, 2 people stood beside a fireplace, contemplating a future that neither had imagined a month ago. The military papers sat on the desk behind them, proof of Lenora's past and possibilities for her future, but her attention was focused on the man beside her and the life they might build together if they had the courage to try. Think about it, Lenora said finally. We don't have to decide today. August nodded, though he suspected his decision was already made. The woman who treated his cattle and tended Sarah's garden and brought life back to his empty house was asking for a chance, not just at marriage, but at partnership, at building something meaningful from the ashes of what they'd both lost. "I'll think about it," he promised, and meant it. But already, the silence of his house felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighed down with grief. Change was coming, as inevitable as winter, and for the first time in months, August found himself looking forward to what that change might bring. The decision came to August in the quiet hours before dawn, as he stood in his kitchen making coffee and watching Lenora tend to a pot of something that smelled like heaven itself. She'd found Sarah's old recipe book tucked behind the flour tin, and over the past few days had been working her way through its pages with the determination of someone learning a new language. "Sarah's beef stew," she said without turning around, somehow sensing his observation. "Though I had to substitute some ingredients. I hope you don't mind the changes." August approached the stove, breathing in the rich aroma that filled his kitchen. For the first time since the fire. "Smells right," he said, surprised by the emotion that tightened his throat. "Better than right." Lenora glanced at him, noting the rough edge in his voice. "I found notes in the margins," she said gently. Little reminders she wrote to herself. "August likes extra carrots. Add honey when winter vegetables are bitter." She was thinking of you when she wrote this. August peered over her shoulder at the open book, seeing Sarah's careful handwriting in the margins, just as Lenora had described. The sight should have brought pain, but instead he felt a strange sense of continuity, as if Sarah were somehow present in the care Lenora was taking with her recipes. "She'd be pleased to know her cooking was being appreciated," August said. "Sarah always said food was love made visible." She was a wise woman. Lenora stirred the pot with gentle reverence. "I hope I can do justice to her recipes." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, but August could sense something different in the air between them, an expectancy, as if they were both waiting for words that needed to be spoken. When Lenora rose to clear the dishes, August caught her hand. "Sit with me a minute," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." Lenora settled back into her chair, her blue eyes attentive but patient. She'd learned to read August's moods over the past weeks, understanding that he chose his words carefully and spoke only when he had something meaningful to say. "I've been alone for 6 months, August began, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Figured I'd stay that way until my time came. Didn't see the point in trying to build something new when everything I'd built before had burned to ash." Lenora remained quiet, giving him space to work through his thoughts. "But these weeks with you here," August paused, searching for the right words. "The house feels alive again. Not the same as it was with Sarah. Different, but good. Different. Like maybe there's still life to be lived, still things worth building." "There are," Lenora said softly, "if you're willing to try." August looked at her across the table. This woman who'd arrived broken and discarded, who'd proven herself competent and kind, who was offering him partnership and hope when he'd thought himself beyond either. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Lenora nodded, her expression serious. "Would you marry me?" The words came out plain and unadorned, without romantic flourishes or passionate declarations. Not because either of us is desperate or lonely, but because we might build something good together, something that honors what we've both lost while giving us reason to hope for what we might find. Lenora's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would be honored to marry you." August felt something tight in his chest finally release. "It won't be a fairy tale," he warned. "I'm not a young man anymore, and I come with more scars than most, and people will talk about the arrangement, about how quickly it's happening." "Let them talk," Lenora said firmly. "I've faced down Confederate cavalry and military tribunals. I think I can handle small-town gossip. They spent the morning making plans with the practical efficiency that characterized their partnership. A simple ceremony at the church, with Preacher Morrison officiating, no grand celebration, but perhaps a dinner for the few neighbors who'd shown them kindness, legal papers drawn up to protect both their interests, and most importantly, time to grow into marriage at their own pace, without pressure or unrealistic expectations. "There's something else we should discuss," Lenora said as they planned. "Your Sarah." August tensed, but Lenora continued with gentle firmness. "I don't want to replace her or compete with her memory. She was your first love, the mother of your dreams, the partner of your youth. But I want to be your partner now, in whatever way feels right to both of us." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "Can you live with that? Can you love me as I am, not as a substitute for someone else?" The question was fair, and August considered it seriously. "I think so," he said finally. "I think Sarah would want that too. She always said love wasn't a pie. Giving some to one person didn't mean less for another." "Wise woman," Lenora repeated, and August heard genuine affection in her voice. The afternoon brought their first test in the form of Martha Henley, arriving unannounced with a covered dish and barely concealed curiosity. August introduced Lenora as his intended bride, watching Martha's eyebrows climb toward her hairline. "Well," Martha said after a moment of stunned silence, "that's sudden." "Sometimes life moves quickly," Lenora replied with dignity. "August has been very kind to someone who needed kindness." Martha's expression softened slightly. "I suppose we could all use more kindness in our lives." She handed over the covered dish, apple pie still warm from her oven. "Consider this an engagement gift then, though you might want to prepare yourselves for questions." After Martha left, August and Lenora sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "Any regrets?" August asked. "None," Lenora replied firmly. "You?" August thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man waiting to die. Now he was planning a wedding, considering the future, feeling hope stir in places he'd thought permanently frozen. "No regrets," he said, "though I reserve the right to panic occasionally." Lenora laughed, the sound bright and warm in the gathering darkness. "Panic permitted. I'll probably do my share." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. Two people who'd found each other at the end of their separate roads and decided to walk the next part of the journey together. Tomorrow would bring challenges, gossip, preparations, the 100 small decisions that accompanied any significant change. But tonight, there was only peace and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd chosen well. Inside the house, Sarah's recipe book lay open on the kitchen table, its pages holding the secrets of a life well lived and love well expressed. Soon those recipes would guide another woman's hands, would fill another home with warmth and nourishment. The thought would have comforted Sarah, August knew. She'd always believed that the best way to honor the past was to embrace the future. With open hands and generous heart, as October deepened toward November, August and Lenora began their new life with the steady determination of people who understood that happiness was not a destination, but a choice made daily, in small acts of kindness and large acts of faith. Their love might not have been the passionate romance of youth, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving loss and choosing hope anyway. The wedding was still 2 weeks away, but in every way that mattered, they were already married, bound together by circumstance, choice, and the simple recognition that some of life's best gifts come disguised as accidents, arriving exactly when they're needed most. The fever returned on a Tuesday morning, striking Lenora with the sudden violence of a summer storm. August found her collapsed in the kitchen, her face flushed with unnatural heat, and her breathing labored in a way that sent ice through his veins. As he carried her to the sofa, her medical bag tumbled from her nerveless fingers, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the scattered instruments and vials, something caught August's eye, a leather portfolio that had been hidden in a secret compartment of the bag. As he knelt to gather the spilled items, official seals and military letterhead became visible through the portfolio's open flap. His hands trembled as he pulled out the documents, and what he read there changed everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd agreed to marry. The first document was a commission dated just 2 years past. Colonel Lenora Vale, Chief Medical Officer, Fort Laramie. Not the dismissed nurse he'd believed her to be, but a full colonel in the United States Army. The second document made his blood run cold, a warrant for her arrest, signed by General Marcus Sheridan himself, charging her with treason, theft of military supplies, and desertion in the face of the enemy. According to the warrant, Colonel Vale had stolen medical supplies worth thousands of dollars, abandoned her post during a critical engagement with hostile tribes, and fled to avoid court-martial. The bounty for her capture was substantial, $500, enough to solve August's financial problems and save his ranch. The warrant was dated 3 weeks ago, which meant bounty hunters and military authorities were likely already searching for her. August sat heavily in his chair, the documents scattered across his lap like accusations. The woman lying unconscious on his sofa, the woman he'd planned to marry in less than 2 weeks, was a wanted fugitive. Every kindness he'd shown her, every moment of growing affection, had been built on a foundation of lies. His first instinct was anger, clean, righteous fury at being deceived. But as he watched Lenora's face, peaceful in unconsciousness and still bearing the marks of recent illness, doubts began to creep in. The woman he'd come to know was many things. Proud, intelligent, competent, but she wasn't a coward or a thief. There had to be more to the story. When Lenora's fever broke that evening, August was waiting with the documents spread on the table before him. She opened her eyes slowly, focusing with difficulty on his grim expression before noticing the papers. "Ah," she said quietly, "you found them." "Colonel," August said, the title heavy with accusation. Lenora struggled to sit up, her movements careful and deliberate. "Yes, I was a colonel. Technically, though I doubt the Army would recognize my rank at this point. The warrant says you're a deserter and a thief." "The warrant says many things." Lenora's voice was steady despite her obvious weakness. "Most of them are lies crafted to justify what they did to me." August gestured to the documents. "Then explain. Help me understand why I'm harboring a fugitive." Lenora was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone unburdening herself of a terrible secret. "Last spring there was an outbreak of cholera among the Lakota near Fort Laramie. Officially, the Army's position was to let it run its course. Fewer hostile Indians meant fewer problems for the settlers. But I'd taken an oath to heal, not to choose who deserved healing based on the color of their skin." She pulled herself more upright, her blue eyes blazing with remembered conviction. "I took medical supplies from the fort's stores, supplies that were sitting unused while people died. I rode into Lakota Territory with a small team of volunteer medics and spent 6 weeks treating the sick, teaching prevention measures, saving lives. And the desertion charge? While I was gone, a cavalry patrol was ambushed 15 miles from the fort. 3 soldiers died, and the Army needed someone to blame for the supposed lack of medical support." Lenora's laugh was bitter. "Never mind. That I was treating sick children and grandparents, not warriors. Never mind that there were other medics available. They said I abandoned my post when my country needed me." August studied her face, reading the truth in her eyes. "So you ran." "I was given a choice. Face court-martial on trumped-up charges." that would likely result in prison or execution or disappear quietly and let them clean up their public relations problem. Lenora met his gaze steadily. I chose to live. Perhaps that makes me a coward, but I chose to live. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. August understood now why she'd been abandoned at that railway station, why she'd been so weak and desperate. She'd been running for her life, using what little money and strength she had to stay ahead of military justice. The bounty, August said quietly. $500. Enough to save your ranch. Lenora's voice was steady, resigned. I know what you're thinking, August. I know what choice makes sense. August looked at the warrant again, seeing the official seals and signatures that could solve all his financial problems with a single decision. Then he looked at the woman who doctored his cattle, tended his wife's garden, and brought life back to his empty house. The woman who'd treated enemy soldiers out of medical duty and Lakota children out of human compassion. They'll come looking. For you, he said. Eventually, yes. Military manhunters are thorough and patient. They'll track down every lead, question every person who might have seen me. Lenora's shoulders straightened with military bearing, despite her weakness. I won't ask you to risk everything for me, August. If you turn me in, I'll understand. But if you're willing to help me disappear, I'll never forget your kindness. August stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land he'd worked for decades, the ranch that represented everything he'd built with Sarah. $500. Would pay the bank, save the cattle, secure his future. All he had to do was ride to town and send a telegram to Fort Laramie. But he thought about the woman who'd insisted on helping despite her illness, who'd shown nothing but competence and compassion in the weeks they'd shared. He thought about Sarah, who'd never turned away someone in need, who'd taught him that character was measured not by convenience, but by choices made when no one was watching. The wedding, he said finally, would have to be called off, of course. Lenora's voice was carefully neutral. I can't marry you under false pretenses, and I won't make you an accessory to harboring a fugitive. August turned from the window, his decision crystallizing with surprising clarity. What if we moved it up? What if we married tomorrow? Lenora stared at him in shock. August, you can't be serious. You know what I am now, what kind of danger. I know you're the woman who saved my cow, restored my garden, and brought hope back into my life. August's voice was firm with conviction. I know you risked your career and freedom to save children who weren't your responsibility. I know you're brave and honest and exactly the kind of person Sarah would have wanted me to find. They'll come for me eventually. Then we'll face that when it happens. Together. August knelt beside the sofa, taking her hands in his. Marry me, Lenora. Not as August Merritt and some woman running from the law, but as two people who found something worth protecting in each other. Tears ran down Lenora's cheeks, the first genuine tears of relief August had seen from her. You could lose everything. I've already lost everything once, August replied. Surviving that taught me that the only things worth having are the ones worth risking everything for. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside the house, two people held each other against the storm, choosing love over safety, principle over profit, and hope over fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater dangers, but tonight there was only the simple recognition that some bonds were strong enough to weather any storm, and some choices defined a person more clearly than any official document ever could. The military commission sat on the table between them, proof of Lenora's past, and the danger that would follow them wherever they went. But August pushed it aside and pulled his intended bride closer, already planning their quiet wedding and the life they'd build together, whatever the cost. The marriage took place the next morning in Preacher Morrison's small study, with only Martha Henley and her husband Tom as witnesses. Lenora wore Sarah's best dress, altered hastily to fit her smaller frame, while August stood beside her in his funeral suit, the only formal clothes he owned. The ceremony was brief and simple, but when August slipped Sarah's wedding ring onto Lenora's finger, the moment carried a weight that transcended the hurried circumstances. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife, Preacher Morrison said, his weathered face creased with concern despite his formal words. He'd asked no questions about the sudden change of date, but his eyes reflected understanding of the gravity beneath their hasty vows. The ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate when the first stranger appeared in town, asking questions at the general store about newcomers, particularly a woman traveling alone. Martha Henley brought word that afternoon, her usual gossip replaced by genuine worry. Military man, by the look of him, she told August quietly, while Lenora prepared tea in the kitchen. Dressed like a civilian, but he carried himself like someone used to giving orders. Asked specifically about a woman matching Lenora's description. August felt the familiar weight of his army Colt beneath his coat, a weapon he'd hoped never to touch again after the war. What did Henrik tell him? That plenty of folks pass through town, and he doesn't keep track of everyone's business. Martha's expression was grim, but the man wasn't satisfied. He's taking a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, says he'll be staying a few days to conduct business. That evening, August and Lenora sat at their kitchen table, making preparations that neither had hoped would be necessary. Lenora had recovered enough strength to think clearly, and her military training showed as she sketched the ranch layout and identified strategic positions. They'll come at dawn, she said with certainty. Standard military doctrine for capturing fugitives: catch them when they're least alert, minimize the chance of escape. Her finger traced paths on the rough map. Probably 3 or 4 men, spread to cover all exits. August studied the drawing, his own tactical knowledge rusty but not forgotten. How long do we have? A day, maybe 2. They'll want to scout the area first, confirm I'm here before they make their move. Lenora looked up from the map, her blue eyes steady despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. August, it's not too late. You could say I deceived you, claim you had no knowledge of my true situation. The marriage certificate would protect you legally. Not happening, August said firmly. We're in this together now. Lenora reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Then we need to prepare. Do you still have your service weapons? August nodded toward the bedroom. Colt revolver and a Winchester rifle. Haven't been cleaned in years, but they'll serve. Clean them tonight, check your ammunition. Lenora's voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded men in battle. How well do you know the terrain around the ranch? Every rock and tree for 5 miles in any direction. August felt a grim satisfaction at her approving nod. Sarah and I used to ride all through these hills. I know places a stranger would never find. They spent the evening in careful preparation. August cleaned and loaded his weapons while Lenora sorted through her medical supplies, preparing a field kit that could treat gunshot wounds. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but August noticed the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. Tell me about the war, she said as they worked. Your war, I mean. I need to know what kind of soldier you were. August paused in his cleaning of the Winchester's action. Nothing like what you did. I was cavalry, mostly scouting and patrol work. Some skirmishes with Confederate raiders, but nothing that would prepare me for what's coming. Combat experience is combat experience, Lenora said firmly. The skills transfer. How do you react under fire? Steady enough, I suppose. August thought back to those long-ago days when he'd worn blue instead of work clothes. Never panicked, never ran. But that was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you were fighting for your country. Tomorrow, you'll be fighting for your wife. Lenora's smile was fierce and proud. I know which motivation runs deeper. They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Not the casual pace of a neighbor, but the measured cadence of someone approaching with purpose. August moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtain to see a lone rider dismounting at their gate. Tom Brennan, August said with relief. Neighbor from the next ranch over. Tom's weathered face was grim as August opened the door. Got word you might be having visitors soon, he said without preamble. Wanted you to know there's folks hereabouts who don't appreciate military men harassing their neighbors. Tom, I can't ask you to—" "Not asking," Tom interrupted. "Telling. Me and the boys from the Patterson spread will be keeping an eye on things. Someone starts shooting, they'll find themselves outnumbered." August felt a rush of gratitude for the unspoken code of the frontier. Neighbors stood by neighbors, regardless of the circumstances. "I appreciate that, Tom. More than you know." "Just watch yourselves," Tom warned. "These military types, they're not used to folks shooting back." After Tom left, August and Lenora continued their preparations with renewed urgency. They moved essential supplies to the barn, where thick walls and multiple exits would provide better tactical advantages than the house. Lenora positioned her medical kit where it could be quickly accessed, while August verified sight lines and fields of fire from various positions. "There's something else," Lenora said as they completed their preparations. "Something I need you to know before tomorrow." August looked up from checking his revolver's cylinder. "What?" "The charges against me, they're not entirely false." Lenora's voice was steady, but August heard the cost of the admission. "I did take military supplies without authorization. I did abandon my assigned post. In the strictest legal sense, I am guilty of the crimes they've charged me with." August holstered his weapon and moved to stand before her. "Do you regret it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I saved 43 lives, August. 43 people who would have died without medical intervention. If that makes me a criminal, then I'll wear the label proudly." "Then that's all I need to know." August cupped her face in his weathered hands. "Sarah always said that when choosing between what's legal and what's right, you choose what's right and accept the consequences." Lenora leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "I love you for that, for seeing who I really am and choosing to stand with me anyway." "I love you too," August replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "Different than what I had with Sarah, but no less real." They spent their last peaceful evening as a married couple, planning for a battle neither wanted, but both knew was inevitable. Outside, the November wind whistled through the eaves, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh winter. But inside their small house, husband and wife prepared to defend their new life with the calm determination of people who had found something worth fighting for. As midnight approached, they took turns keeping watch while the other rested. August found himself studying Lenora's sleeping face, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the determined set of her jaw even in sleep. This woman, his wife, had risked everything to save strangers, had chosen compassion over safety, principle over career. Whatever came tomorrow, he would not let her face it alone. The last thing August saw before dawn was Lenora checking her medical supplies one final time, her movements precise and professional despite the danger they faced. She caught him watching and smiled, not the desperate expression of someone facing impossible odds, but the confident look of a soldier preparing for a mission she intended to win. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," August confirmed, though he knew that nothing could truly prepare them for what the morning would bring. Outside, the first grey light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon, and somewhere in that growing light, men with guns and warrants were preparing to take his wife away. But August Merritt had survived the loss of everything once before, and he had learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to fight for it. The battle for their future was about to begin. They came with the first full light of dawn, 4 men on horseback approaching the ranch with the methodical precision of military professionals. August watched them through the barn's loft window, noting their spread formation and the way they moved, not like bounty hunters motivated by reward money, but like soldiers following orders. "Military," he confirmed to Lenora, who was positioned near the barn's side door with her medical bag and a clear view of the house. "Probably sent directly from Fort Laramie." The lead rider was a tall man with the bearing of an officer, his civilian clothes unable to disguise years of military posture. He raised his hand to halt his companions at the ranch gate, then called out in a voice trained to carry across parade grounds, "August Merritt, We know you're harboring a fugitive from military justice. Send out Colonel Lenora Vale, and no one needs to get hurt." August remained silent, his Winchester steady against the loft window frame. They discussed this moment. Any response would only confirm Lenora's presence and give away their positions. After waiting a full minute for reply, the officer spoke again. "We have warrants for Colonel Vale's arrest and authority to search these premises. You have 1 minute to comply before we take necessary action." "Arrogant," Lenora whispered from her position. "They expect frontier compliance with military authority." The minute passed with no response from the ranch buildings. August watched the officer signal his men, who began to spread out according to what was clearly a rehearsed plan. 2 would approach the house from front and back while the other 2 secured the barn and outbuildings. "Here they come," August murmured. The first soldier to approach the barn moved with professional caution, his rifle ready but not quite aimed. He was young, probably new to this kind of duty, and his nervousness showed in the way he kept glancing at the house, rather than focusing on his immediate surroundings. August let him reach the barn door before speaking. "That's far enough, son." The soldier spun toward the voice, trying to locate its source while keeping his weapon ready. "Show yourself. We have legal authority here." "Maybe you do," August replied, his voice echoing from the loft in a way that made pinpointing his location difficult. "But this is my land, and you're trespassing. State your business properly or move along. We're here for Colonel Vale. Hand her over and we'll be gone." "Don't know anyone by that name." August's lie was steady and convincing. "Just me and my wife here, and we don't appreciate armed strangers on our property." From her position, Lenora could see the second soldier moving around the barn's far side, attempting to flank August's position. She gripped her surgical instruments. In the right hands, a scalpel could be as effective as any weapon, and prepared to act if necessary. The young soldier at the barn door was growing agitated. "Sir, we have information that the fugitive is hiding here. We're authorized to search all buildings." "You have a warrant for that search?" August asked. "We have military authority." "This isn't military territory, son. Wyoming law applies here, and Wyoming law requires proper warrants for searches." August's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. "Unless you've got papers signed by a territorial judge, you best stay off my property." The soldier looked uncertain, clearly not prepared for legal challenges to military authority. August used the moment of hesitation to shift position in the loft, moving to a better angle for what he suspected was coming next. The officer, apparently tired of negotiation, made the decision that would escalate everything. "Stevens, check the house. Morrison, secure the barn. We're done talking." August watched the young soldier, Stevens, hesitate for just a moment before raising his rifle and moving toward the barn door. The time for words had passed. "Don't do it, son," August warned, his Winchester now aimed with deadly precision. "I've got no quarrel with you, but I'll defend my property and my wife." Stevens paused again, clearly torn between orders and common sense. But military training won out, and he continued his advance toward the barn. August's first shot was deliberately high, splintering wood above Stevens's head and sending the young soldier diving for cover behind a water trough. The crack of the Winchester echoed across the ranch yard, signaling the beginning of a fight none of them wanted, but all were now committed to. "Take cover!" the officer shouted. "Return fire!" The morning exploded into violence as rifles began speaking from multiple positions. August ducked as bullets whined through the loft, splinters of wood raining down around him. From below, he heard Lenora moving to a more protected position, her medical training keeping her calm even as combat erupted around them. "August," she called. "North window, second man approaching." August swung his rifle toward the new threat, seeing Morrison moving in a crouch toward the barn's rear entrance. The soldier was older, more experienced, and his advance showed the patience of a veteran who understood that rushed movement got you killed. But August had advantages these men couldn't appreciate: intimate knowledge of his own property, prepared positions, and most importantly, something worth fighting for that went beyond following orders. This was his land, his wife, his future they were trying to take away. He fired again, this time with intent to wound rather than warn. Morrison cried out and stumbled, clutching his shoulder, but still maintaining his grip on his weapon. The man was tough. August had to respect that even as he prepared to fire again. From the house came the sound of breaking glass and shouted orders. The officer and his remaining man were forcing entry, clearly intent on searching for Lenora, regardless of legal niceties. August felt a cold rage building in his chest. These men had invaded his home, threatened his wife, and shown complete disregard for anything but their military authority. The war was no longer 20 years in the past. It was here now, in his barn and his house, threatening everything he'd rebuilt from the ashes of loss. And August Merritt, veteran of forgotten skirmishes and husband of barely 24 hours, prepared to show these military professionals what a man would do when pushed too far. The battle for the ranch house intensified as the officer and his companion forced their way inside, the sound of overturned furniture and shouted demands echoing across the yard. August knew they'd find nothing. Lenora was with him in the barn, but their violation of his home filled him with a rage that burned colder than winter wind. "Lenora," he called. "They're in the house." "I know." Her voice was steady despite the bullets that had begun to chew splinters from the barn walls. "Let them search. They won't find what they're looking for." Stevens had recovered from his shock and was now firing with more purpose, forcing August to keep his head down as bullets whistled through the loft. But the young soldier's position behind the water trough left him exposed to crossfire, and August was already planning how to exploit that weakness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made August risk a glance toward the road. Relief flooded through him as he recognized Tom Brennan and 3 other local ranchers, armed and riding hard toward the ranch. The cavalry, his own cavalry, was arriving just when he needed them most. "Military boys," Tom's voice boomed across the yard. "This is local law. Cease fire and state your business." The officer appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "This is federal business. Stand down." "Show me your federal warrant," Tom replied, his rifle trained on the officer with steady precision. "Signed by a federal judge, not some military paper pusher." August used the momentary distraction to move positions in the loft, angling for a better shot at Stevens. But as he shifted, his boot caught on a loose board, and the slight sound was enough to give away his location. Stevens' next shot came, close enough to burn August's cheek, and he realized the young soldier was learning quickly. From below came Lenora's voice, urgent with medical authority. "Morrison's hit badly. He needs immediate attention or he'll bleed out." August could see the wounded soldier behind the barn, clutching his shoulder where August's bullet had found its mark. Blood was seeping between Morrison's fingers at a rate that spoke of arterial damage, and his face was growing pale with shock. "Let me help him," Lenora called to Stevens. "I'm a doctor." "Stay back," Stevens shouted, his voice cracking with stress. "Don't move, or I'll shoot." But Lenora was already moving, her medical bag in one hand and a white cloth in the other, an improvised flag of truce that she hoped would be respected even in the midst of combat. She approached Morrison's position with the confident stride of someone who'd treated wounded men under fire before. "Soldier, your friend is dying," she said firmly to Stevens. "I can save him, but only if you let me work." Stevens looked torn between his orders and the obvious fact that Morrison needed help. The wounded man had stopped returning fire and was now focused entirely on trying to stem his bleeding, never a good sign in a combat situation. August held his fire, recognizing that Lenora was taking a calculated risk to save a man's life. Even in the middle of a firefight, her medical oath took precedence over personal safety. It was exactly the kind of courage that had gotten her in trouble with the military in the first place. "Colonel Vale," the officer called from the house, finally putting the pieces together. "We know you're out there. Surrender now, and your husband won't be charged as an accomplice." "Go to hell," August shouted back, his patience finally exhausted. "You come onto my land with guns, threaten my wife, and expect me to cooperate? You picked the wrong rancher, friend." Lenora had reached Morrison and was already working to control his bleeding, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around them. Stevens kept his rifle trained on her but didn't fire. Even he could see that she was trying to save his partner's life. "Pressure here," Lenora instructed Morrison, guiding his hand to the wound. "The bullet nicked your subclavian artery, but I can repair it if you stay still." From her medical bag came instruments that gleamed like silver in the morning light. Forceps, sutures, surgical scissors, tools of healing being deployed in a war zone, which struck August as perfectly appropriate for the woman he'd married. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the arrival of Sheriff Blake from town changed everything. The sheriff rode into the yard with his deputy, both men armed but clearly not aligned with either side in the conflict. "What in hell is going on here?" Blake demanded, his voice carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement. The officer stepped forward, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances. "Sheriff, we're here on federal business." "With what documentation?" Blake interrupted. "Because I've got complaints about armed men terrorizing local citizens, and that falls under my jurisdiction until proven otherwise." August watched from the loft as legal authority clashed with military power. This was the moment that would determine whether he and Lenora would face justice or persecution, whether their marriage certificate would provide legal protection or prove meaningless against federal charges. "Sheriff," August called down, "I've got their wounded man here, and my wife is treating him. These men came onto my property with guns, no warrants, making threats. I defended my home and my family." "Sheriff," Blake nodded grimly, "that's your right under territorial law." He turned to the officer. "Unless you've got proper documentation, you're trespassing and disturbing the peace. I'm ordering you to stand down." The officer's face reddened with frustrated authority. "This woman is a fugitive from military justice. Then bring me proper extradition papers," Blake said firmly. "Until then, she's a territorial citizen under my protection." The marriage certificate, their salvation, lay in that simple document that proved Lenora's legal status as a territorial resident and August's wife. Military law had no jurisdiction over civilian marriages, and Sheriff Blake understood that distinction even if the federal authorities chose to ignore it. As Lenora worked to save Morrison's life and legal arguments flew over their heads, August realized that their desperate gamble was working. Love and local law were proving stronger than military authority and federal warrants. The battle for their future was far from over, but for the first time since the shooting started, August allowed himself to believe they might actually win. Spring arrived early that year, melting the winter snow and revealing the changes that a season of quiet work had wrought across the Merritt ranch. August stood on his porch in the pre-dawn light, watching the sunrise paint the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and rose, marveling at how different this view felt from the one that had greeted him a year ago. The legal battles had taken months to resolve. Sheriff Blake's intervention had prevented Lenora's immediate arrest, but federal authorities don't surrender their claims easily. Lawyers had been involved, territorial courts consulted, and precedents established. In the end, it was Lenora's marriage certificate and her documented medical service to the community that saved her. The military found it politically difficult to prosecute a woman who'd become known throughout the territory as the Angel of Cedar Falls, especially when her supposed crimes involved saving lives rather than taking them. The official resolution came in the form of a terse letter from the War Department, charges dismissed due to insufficient evidence and territorial jurisdiction complications. Not exactly an apology, but vindication nonetheless. Lenora had wept when August read her the letter, tears of relief for a burden she'd carried for too long. Now, as August sipped his morning coffee and watched the sun climb higher, he could see the evidence of their partnership everywhere he looked. The garden that Lenora had restored from Sarah's neglected beds was larger now, encompassing not just vegetables and herbs, but medicinal plants that supplied her growing practice. Patients came from as far as 50 miles away to consult with the woman who could set bones as expertly as any doctor and diagnose illnesses with the precision of trained military medicine. The barn had been rebuilt and expanded, housing not just August's recovered cattle herd, but also the gentle mare that Lenora rode on her medical calls. The ranch prospered in ways that went beyond mere financial success. It had become a place of healing for both bodies and souls, a sanctuary where broken things could be mended if given proper care and attention. August heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Lenora emerging from the house, her medical bag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She'd gained weight over the winter, her face filling out with health and contentment until she barely resembled the wraith he'd rescued from that railway platform. "Early call?" August asked, noting her traveling clothes. "Mrs. Henderson's baby is coming," Lenora replied, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd built together the previous summer. "A third child, so it should be straightforward, but she's nervous about the delivery." August nodded, understanding the mixture of anticipation and concern that accompanied new life. "You'll be careful?" "Always am." Lenora smiled, the expression transforming her features with warmth that still took August's breath away. "Besides, I have something very important to come home to." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the ranch come alive with morning activity. In the distance, Tom Brennan's son was helping August move cattle to fresh pasture, the boy eager to learn ranching from someone he considered a local hero. The story of the standoff with federal authorities had grown in the telling, transforming August from a grieving widower into a romantic figure who'd risked everything for love. "Any regrets?" August asked, the question that had become a ritual between them. "Only one," Lenora replied, her voice thoughtful. "I regret that it took almost dying to find you." August reached for her hand, noting the wedding ring that caught the morning light. Sarah's ring, but worn now by someone who honored its meaning while creating new memories of her own. The sight no longer brought pain, only a sense of continuity that Sarah would have approved of. "Speaking of finding things," Lenora said, her tone carefully casual, "I found something yesterday that I thought you should see." She pulled a wooden sign from behind the porch railing, newly carved and painted with letters that declared, "Merritt Ranch, August and Lenora, Esther 1883, cattle, horses and medical services." August studied the sign, noting the way their names were linked together, the acknowledgement of both his traditional ranching and her medical practice. It was a declaration of partnership, of shared dreams and mutual respect. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Tom Brennan carved it. Said every successful ranch needed proper identification." Lenora's smile was mischievous. "I may have mentioned that we were planning to expand operations." "Expand how?" "Well," Lenora said, settling more comfortably against his shoulder, "I've been thinking about establishing a proper medical clinic, maybe training other women in basic nursing skills. And you've mentioned wanting to try horse breeding, since the mare took so well to ranch life." August considered the possibility she was outlining, a future that extended far beyond mere survival, encompassing growth and community service, and the kind of legacy that would outlast both of them. It was ambitious, optimistic, and exactly the kind of dream that Sarah would have encouraged. "Sounds like a lot of work," he said. "The best things usually are." Lenora tilted her head to look at him directly. "Are you willing to try?" August thought about the question seriously, as he did most things. A year ago, he'd been a broken man waiting to die, convinced that life held no more possibilities for joy or purpose. Now he was married to a remarkable woman, operating a thriving ranch and contemplating a future filled with potential. "I'm willing," he said finally, "more than willing." As if summoned by their conversation, Tom Brennan's wagon appeared on the horizon, bringing lumber for the clinic expansion and news from town. Life was calling, as it always did, demanding attention and energy and hope. August helped Lenora down from the porch and watched her ride toward the Henderson ranch, her medical bag secure and her bearing confident. She'd grown into her new life, with the same competence she'd brought to everything else, transforming from a discarded refugee into a pillar of the community. As he walked toward the barn to begin his own day's work, August caught sight of the new sign leaning against the porch rail. Merritt Ranch! August and Lenora. Their names linked together not by accident or desperation, but by choice and commitment, and the recognition that some partnerships were strong enough to weather any storm. The morning was beautiful, full of promise and possibility. And August Merritt, who'd learned that love could arrive more than once in a lifetime if a man was brave enough to recognize it, began another day of building something worth leaving behind. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, the same railway that had brought both tragedy and salvation to his door. But August no longer flinched at the sound. Some trains brought sorrow, others brought hope. The difference lay not in the trains themselves, but in the choices people made when unexpected passengers arrived on their platform. He'd made his choice, and it had made all the difference.